The Wyoming winter of 1882 hit harder than anyone in Fort Laramie could remember, and Marcus Jefferson found himself alone in a crude cabin with 4 screaming newborns and a dead wife growing cold in their bed. Marcus had been a cowboy for 12 years, driving cattle from Texas to Kansas, breaking wild horses, sleeping under stars that seemed close enough to touch. He had weathered stampedes and rattlesnake bites, had survived a Comanche arrow that still left his shoulder stiff on cold mornings. But nothing in those hard years had prepared him for the sight of Sarah's pale face, or the realization that he now had 4 tiny lives depending on him, and no earthly idea how to keep them alive. The midwife had fled when the blizzard started, promising to return, but that had been 2 days ago. The snow outside reached the windowsills now, and the wind howled like something alive and hungry. He had wrapped Sarah in the quilt her mother made, the one with the wedding ring pattern, and moved her to the small root cellar where the cold would preserve her until the ground thawed enough for burial. It was the only practical thing to do, but his hands had shaken so badly he could barely manage the door latch. Then he had returned to the babies, 4 impossibly small creatures with red faces and grasping fingers, and he had wept until no more tears would come. The first night alone, Marcus discovered that babies needed to eat constantly. Sarah had nursed them before she died, her strength failing even as she tried to feed each one, her voice getting weaker as she told him their names. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, she had whispered because she wanted them to have the strength of Scripture. Marcus had nodded, holding her hand, not understanding yet that these would be the last words she spoke to him. He had a milk cow in the barn, a sturdy creature named Bess who had survived the initial blast of the blizzard. The barn was only 30 feet from the cabin, but those 30 feet might as well have been 30 miles. The snow was deep enough to swallow a man, and the wind strong enough to knock him off his feet. Marcus tied a rope from the cabin door to the barn entrance, and he made that journey every 6 hours, fighting through drifts that came up to his chest, his fingers going numb inside his gloves, his face burning with cold. He milked Bess with clumsy hands, then heated the milk over the fire and tried to feed the babies with a rag soaked in warm milk, letting them suck at it like makeshift teats. Some of the milk went into their mouths. Most of it ended up on their faces, on his hands, soaking into the blankets he had wrapped them in. They cried constantly, a sound that drilled into his skull and made him want to scream back at them. But he kept trying, kept dipping the rag, kept holding it to their tiny mouths, because the alternative was unthinkable. By the 3rd day, Marcus had not slept more than an hour at a time. His eyes burned, his back ached from hunching over the babies, and his mind felt foggy and slow. The cabin reeked of sour milk and soiled cloths. He had run out of clean rags and was now using his own shirts, torn into strips. The fire needed constant tending because if it went out, they would all freeze before he could get it started again. He fed the babies, changed them, held them when they cried, and somehow the hours passed in a blur of exhaustion and desperation. The food situation was dire. He had beans and salt pork, some flour and cornmeal, a little sugar and coffee. No vegetables, no fruit, nothing fresh or green. He made himself eat because he knew he needed strength, but the food tasted like ash in his mouth. He thought about Sarah constantly, about the way she laughed at his terrible jokes, about how she had looked on their wedding day 3 years ago, her dark hair pinned up with wildflowers, her eyes shining with hope for their future together. On the 4th day, the wind finally stopped. The sudden silence woke Marcus from a fitful doze in the rocking chair, a baby cradled in each arm. He stood carefully, placed the infants in the wooden crate he had lined with blankets to serve as a makeshift cradle, and went to the window. The world outside was white and still, buried under snow that sparkled in the weak sunlight. The sky was a pale blue, innocent-looking, giving no hint of the fury it had unleashed. Marcus knew he should feel relief, but all he felt was a deeper dread. The blizzard was over, but his isolation was not. Fort Laramie was 5 miles away, and there was no way to reach it through snow this deep. No one would be able to reach him either, not for days or maybe weeks. He was still alone, still responsible for keeping 4 helpless babies alive with nothing but cow's milk and sheer stubbornness. He made another trip to the barn, easier this time without the wind trying to kill him. Bess lowed softly when he entered, and he pressed his forehead against her warm flank for a moment, taking comfort from another living creature. He milked her, checked on his horse Thunder who stood in the next stall looking miserable but alive, and then trudged back to the cabin with a pail of fresh milk. The babies were crying again. They were always crying, or at least it seemed that way. Marcus heated the milk and went through the feeding ritual, moving from one infant to the next, trying to remember which one he had fed last. They looked so similar. 4 tiny boys with wisps of dark hair and eyes that were still the cloudy blue of newborns. Sarah had been able to tell them apart instantly, but to Marcus, they were an indistinguishable mass of need and noise. That afternoon, he attempted to make bread. Sarah had always made their bread, her hands sure and practiced as she kneaded the dough, but Marcus had watched her often enough. He mixed flour and water and a pinch of salt, added some sourdough starter from the crock Sarah kept near the stove, and tried to work it into something that resembled dough. The result was a sticky mess that clung to his fingers and the table and seemed to get everywhere, except where it was supposed to be. He persevered, eventually forming the gluey mass into a rough loaf and shoving it into the Dutch oven to bake. The bread that emerged an hour later was dense and heavy, with a crust so hard it could have been used as a weapon. But it was edible, and Marcus tore off a chunk and chewed it methodically, thinking that Sarah would have laughed herself sick at his attempt. The thought made his chest tight, and he had to stop eating until the feeling passed. The days began to blend together. Wake, feed babies, milk cow, feed himself, feed babies again, change rags, wash rags in melted snow water, feed babies, tend fire, feed babies, sleep for an hour, repeat. The isolation pressed down on him like a physical weight. He talked to the babies because hearing a voice, even his own, helped keep the silence at bay. He told them about their mother, about how beautiful she was, how kind. He told them about cattle drives and the open plains, about the time he saw a grizzly bear from 50 yards away, and thought his heart might stop. He told them about anything and everything, and they responded with cries and gurgles and the occasional moment of quiet that felt like a gift from heaven. On the 7th day after Sarah's death, Marcus woke from a brief sleep to find one of the babies burning with fever. He did not know which one, could not tell them apart well enough to be sure, but the tiny body was hot to the touch, and the crying had taken on a weak, mewling quality that terrified him. He bathed the infant in lukewarm water, remembering something Sarah had once said about breaking fevers, and he held the small form against his chest, feeling the heat radiating through the blanket. He prayed then, for the first time since Sarah died. He was not a particularly religious man, despite being raised by a Methodist mother who had insisted on Sunday services. But he prayed with everything in him, promised God anything if this child would just live, if all 4 of them would just survive until help could come. The baby's fever broke near dawn, and Marcus wept again, this time from relief so intense it made him dizzy. The next morning, he saw smoke in the distance. It was just a thin gray line against the white landscape, but it meant someone else was alive out there, someone close enough to reach once the snow melted a bit more. The sight of that smoke gave him hope for the first time in over a week. He was not completely alone in the world. Somewhere beyond the drifts and the frozen creek, other people were fighting to survive this brutal winter. But hope did not fill empty bellies or clean, soiled rags. Marcus continued his routine, each day exactly like the one before. His bread making improved slightly, though the loaves were still dense enough to use as doorstops. He learned to tell the babies apart by small differences. Matthew had a birthmark on his left shoulder. Mark sneezed more than the others. Luke had a slightly crooked little toe, and John's cry was lower pitched. These tiny distinctions became important to Marcus, made them individuals instead of just an overwhelming mass of responsibility. 2 weeks after the blizzard ended, Marcus was down to his last pound of flour. The beans were gone. The salt pork was nearly finished. He had plenty of milk from Bess, and he had been giving the babies milk exclusively, but he needed food himself to keep going. He considered trying to hunt, but the idea of leaving the infants alone for the hours that would require was impossible. If something happened while he was gone, if one of them choked or stopped breathing, he would never forgive himself. He was mixing the last of the flour with water, trying to make it stretch into 2 more loaves of his terrible bread, when he heard the sound. It was faint at first, easily mistaken for wind, but it grew steadily louder. Voices. Human voices calling out in the cold air. Marcus left his dough and went to the door, throwing it open. The cold hit him like a fist, but he barely felt it. There, trudging up the path toward his cabin, was a sight that made him question his sanity. A woman on a mule, leading 2 more mules loaded with supplies, all 3 animals struggling through the deep snow. She wore a heavy coat and a wide-brimmed hat, and even from a distance Marcus could see the determined set of her shoulders. He stood frozen in the doorway, unable to quite believe what he was seeing. Behind him, one of the babies started crying, then another, and the sound seemed to spur him into action. He grabbed his coat and boots, shoved his feet into them without bothering to lace them properly, and ran out into the snow. The woman saw him and raised one gloved hand in greeting. As Marcus got closer, he could make out her features. She was younger than he had first thought, maybe 25 or 26, with a face that was pretty in a practical, no-nonsense way. Her eyes were a striking green, visible even in the harsh winter light, and they assessed him with a directness that might have made him uncomfortable under other circumstances. "You Marcus Jefferson," she called out when they were close enough to speak without shouting. "Yes," he managed, his voice rough from disuse. "How did you know?" "I am Willa Anderson," she said, bringing the mule to a stop. "I run the bakery in Fort Laramie. Folks in town have been worried sick about you and Sarah. When the snow finally packed down enough for the animals to get through, I volunteered to check on you." Her eyes moved past him to the cabin, and her expression shifted. "Where is Sarah? And the babies? I heard she had the babies right before the storm hit." Marcus felt his throat close up. He could not speak, could only shake his head. The woman, Willa, seemed to understand immediately. Her face softened with sympathy, and she dismounted from the mule with practiced ease. "I am so sorry," she said quietly. "When?" "The night they were born," Marcus said, and his voice cracked on the words. "2 weeks ago. She had 4 boys, and the birth was too much for her. The midwife left because of the storm, and I could not do anything to save her." Willa reached out and gripped his arm, her hand strong even through the layers of clothing. "And the babies?" "Alive," Marcus said. "All 4 of them barely. I have been feeding them milk from my cow, But I do not know what I am doing, and I am out of food for myself, and I have not slept more than an hour at a time in 2 weeks, and I think I might be going crazy." The words tumbled out in a rush, and Marcus realized he was shaking. Willa's grip on his arm tightened, and she steered him back toward the cabin with gentle firmness. "You are not going crazy," she said. "You are exhausted and grieving and trying to do the impossible all by yourself, but you are not alone anymore. I brought bread and supplies, and I know how to care for babies. My sister had twins last year, and I helped her through it. 4 will be harder, but we will manage." The relief that washed over Marcus at those words was so powerful it made his knees weak. "We." She had said we. He was not alone anymore. Inside the cabin, Willa took one look around and immediately started issuing instructions. She sent Marcus to unload the mules and stable them in the barn while she assessed the situation with the babies. By the time he returned, arms loaded with sacks of flour, beans, dried apples, and several loaves of real bread that made his mouth water just looking at them. She had the infants lined up on the bed and was examining each one with gentle, efficient hands. "They are thin," she said without looking up, "but they do not look sick. You have done better than you think, Marcus. These boys are alive because of you." Marcus set down the supplies and rubbed his eyes. "I have been so scared. Every time one of them cries different or feels warm, I think they are dying." "That is normal for any new parent," Willa said. "But cow's milk is not enough for babies this small. They need something richer. I brought canned milk and some other things that will help." She glanced at him. "When did you last eat a proper meal?" "I do not remember," Marcus admitted. "Right. You are going to sit down and eat some of this bread while I heat water and make a feeding mixture for these boys. Then you are going to sleep for more than an hour while I watch them." Marcus wanted to argue, to say he could not just hand over responsibility like that, but his body overruled his mind. He sat down at the table and picked up one of the loaves Willa had brought. The bread was soft and golden, with a crust that crackled when he broke it open. The inside was tender and still slightly warm, and when he bit into it, the taste was so good he nearly wept for the 3rd time that day. Willa worked as she talked, her movements quick and sure. She mixed canned milk with water and a little sugar, heated it to the right temperature, and showed Marcus how to feed the babies using a small bottle with a rubber nipple that she had brought with her. "This will work better than rags," she said, demonstrating on Matthew, who latched onto the nipple and began sucking eagerly. "See, he knows what to do." Marcus watched, fascinated, as the baby drank with an enthusiasm he had not seen before. The milk disappeared from the bottle and Matthew's eyes drifted closed in contentment. "Where did you get those bottles?" Marcus asked. "Mail order from Chicago," Willa said. "They are fairly new. A woman in town had them sent for her baby. I borrowed them when I heard what happened." She moved to the next baby, repeating the process. "I also brought cloth diapers, some ready-made infant gowns, and enough food to keep you going for a month at least." "I cannot pay you," Marcus said quietly. "Not right now. I have a little money saved, but it will have to last until I can work again." Willa looked at him with those clear green eyes. "I am not asking for payment. The people in Fort Laramie take care of their own. Sarah was well loved in town, and everyone is heartbroken about what happened. This is the least we can do." The simple kindness of it broke something loose in Marcus's chest. He had been holding himself together through sheer will, but now, with help finally here, with someone else to share the burden, he felt himself crumbling. He put his face in his hands and let the grief pour out of him in great shaking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his bones. Willa did not try to comfort him with empty words. She simply continued feeding the babies, giving him space to fall apart, and somehow that made it easier. When the storm of emotion finally passed, Marcus raised his head to find her watching him with understanding. "It gets easier," she said softly. "Not today and not tomorrow, but eventually. The grief never goes away completely, but it gets easier to carry." "You sound like you know from experience," Marcus said, wiping his face with his sleeve. "My husband died 3 years ago," Willa said, focusing on the baby in her arms. "Pneumonia, in the middle of summer when you would not expect it. We had only been married for a year. I thought my life was over." She paused, then continued. "But I kept going because I had to. I had the bakery and people needed bread. Such a simple thing, but it gave me a reason to get up every morning. Eventually, the mornings got easier, and then the days, and then I realized I was going to be all right after all." They looked at each other across the small cabin, two people who had loved and lost, who understood the weight of continuing when part of you wanted to give up. Marcus felt something shift in that moment, a recognition of a kindred spirit, though he was too tired and too overwhelmed to examine the feeling closely. "You should sleep now," Willa said. "I will watch the babies. If I need you, I will wake you." Marcus tried to protest, but exhaustion dragged at him like chains. He made it to the bed, remembered that Sarah had died there, and hesitated. Willa seemed to read his mind. "I changed the bedding while you were bringing in the supplies," she said gently. "It is all right." Marcus lay down on the fresh sheets that smelled like soap and winter air, and he was asleep before he could think about it further. He woke 8 hours later to the sound of humming. For a confused moment, he thought it was Sarah, that everything had been a terrible nightmare, but then reality reassembled itself, and he sat up to find Willa sitting in the rocking chair with 2 babies cradled in her arms, humming a tune he did not recognize. "You let me sleep too long," he said, his voice thick with sleep. "You needed it," Willa replied, not stopping her gentle rocking. "These boys and I have been getting along just fine. They have eaten twice, been changed, and had some wake time. Right now they are settling down for another nap." Marcus swung his legs out of bed and rubbed his face. He felt better than he had in weeks, though the grief was still there, a heavy stone in his chest. But the desperate edge of panic had dulled, and he could think more clearly. "How long can you stay?" he asked. Willa looked at him thoughtfully. "I was planning to go back tomorrow, but looking at the situation, I think I should stay longer. The bakery is closed anyway because of the storm damage. My assistant is managing the cleanup, and he does not need me standing over his shoulder. If you want the help, I can stay for a week or so. Give you time to get your feet under you." "I want the help," Marcus said immediately. "I need it. These boys need it." "Then I will stay," Willa said simply. Over the next few days they fell into a routine. Willa took over most of the baby care, showing Marcus techniques for burping them, for soothing their cries, for changing diapers efficiently. She cooked real meals, soups and stews that filled the cabin with smells that made Marcus's stomach growl. She baked bread in the Dutch oven, loaves that were golden and perfect, and the sight of them made Marcus realize how much he had been merely surviving rather than living. They talked while they worked, sharing pieces of their lives in the way that people do when circumstances force intimacy. Willa told him about growing up in Ohio, about how she had come west with her husband who had dreams of starting a ranch. When he died, she had used the little money they had saved to buy the bakery, and she had built a life for herself through sheer determination and skill. Marcus told her about his years as a cowboy, about drives where they moved 5,000 head of cattle across rivers and through drought. He told her about meeting Sarah at a church social in Cheyenne, about how she had been wearing a yellow dress and had laughed at something her friend said, and that laugh had caught his attention like nothing else ever had. He told her about their quiet wedding, about building this cabin with his own hands, about their plans to start a ranch and raise a family. "You did raise a family," Willa pointed out gently. "It just happened in a way you never expected." Marcus looked at the 4 babies, all asleep in the wooden crate that was serving as their shared crib, and felt his heart constrict. "I do not know how to be a father to them without Sarah. She was supposed to be the one who knew about children." "No one knows about children until they have them," Willa said. "You learn as you go, and you are not alone. You have neighbors, friends in town, people who will help." "I have you," Marcus said, and then stopped, surprised by his own words. Willa met his eyes and something passed between them, a spark of awareness that made Marcus's breath catch. She was beautiful, he realized. Not in the delicate way Sarah had been beautiful, but in a strong, capable way that suited her personality. Her hands were marked with small burns from years of working with ovens, and there was a dusting of flour in her dark blonde hair that she had not noticed, and Marcus found himself wanting to reach out and brush it away. He looked down instead, confused by the feeling. Sarah had been dead for less than 3 weeks. He had no business noticing another woman, no matter how kind or helpful she was being. If Willa noticed his sudden awkwardness, she did not comment on it. She simply returned to mending one of his shirts that had torn during his struggles through the snow, her needle flashing in the lamplight. That night, after the babies were fed and settled, Willa made a pallet for herself on the floor near the fire. Marcus protested, offering her the bed, but she refused. "You need proper sleep more than I do," she insisted. "Besides, I am used to early mornings. I have been waking at 4 in the morning to start bread for years. Sleeping on a floor is nothing." Marcus wanted to argue further but recognized the stubborn set of her jaw. Instead, he said, "Thank you for everything. I do not know how to repay you." "You do not need to repay kindness," Willa said, settling herself on the blankets. "That is not how it works." Marcus lay in bed, listening to the fire crackle and the small sounds of the baby's breathing, and he thought about kindness, about the woman who had ridden 5 miles through snow-packed trails to bring bread and hope to a desperate stranger. He thought about Sarah, about the love they had shared and the future they would never have. He thought about the 4 tiny lives that depended on him and how terrifying and overwhelming that responsibility felt. But for the first time since the blizzard, he also felt something else. A small flicker of possibility, a sense that maybe, somehow, things might work out after all. The week Willa had promised to stay stretched into 2 and then 3. The weather remained cold but clear, and slowly the snow began to recede. Other neighbors made their way to the cabin once the trails were passable, bringing more supplies, offering condolences, marveling at the 4 babies who had survived against all odds. They also brought news that the town doctor would come as soon as he could to check on the infants and make sure they were thriving. During those weeks, Marcus learned more about caring for his sons than he had thought possible. He learned that Matthew liked to be held upright after feeding or he would spit up, that Mark needed to be walked around the cabin to settle down, that Luke would only sleep if he was swaddled tightly, and that John preferred lying on his stomach, despite Willa's warnings that it was not the safest position. He learned to change diapers without gagging, to heat milk to the perfect temperature, to recognize the different types of cries that meant hungry versus wet versus just wanting attention. He also learned about Willa. He learned that she hummed when she was concentrating, that she had a quick temper when something went wrong, but got over it just as quickly. He learned that she loved books and had left most of her small collection with a friend in town because she had not had room to bring them. He learned that she was afraid of spiders but would kill a mouse without flinching, that she made the best biscuits he had ever tasted, and that her laugh was warm and genuine and made something in his chest feel lighter. They did not talk about the growing connection between them. It felt too soon, too complicated, too disrespectful to Sarah's memory. But it was there anyway, in the way their hands would brush when passing a baby back and forth, in the comfortable silences that stretched between them, in the way Marcus found himself watching her when she was not looking, memorizing the curve of her cheek and the graceful movement of her hands. 3 weeks after Willa arrived, the town doctor finally made his way to the cabin. Dr. Harrison was a gruff man in his 50s with gentle hands and a thorough approach to his work. He examined each baby carefully, listened to their hearts and lungs, checked their eyes and mouths, and declared them all remarkably healthy considering the circumstances of their birth and first weeks of life. "You have done well by them," he told Marcus. "Both of you," he added, nodding to Willa. "These boys are small, but they are gaining weight and their color is good. Keep doing what you are doing." After the doctor left, Marcus felt another weight lift from his shoulders. The babies were going to be all right. They were going to survive and grow and have lives of their own. It seemed like a miracle, and in many ways it was. That evening, as they sat together after the babies were settled, Willa brought up the subject Marcus had been dreading. "I need to go back to Fort Laramie soon," she said quietly. "The bakery has been closed for nearly a month. I am losing income I can barely afford to lose." Marcus had known this was coming, but it still hit him hard. The thought of being alone again, of losing Willa's presence and help and companionship, made his stomach knot. "I understand," he said, because what else could he say? She had her own life, her own responsibilities. She had already given him far more than he had any right to expect. "You could come with me," Willa said, not looking at him. "You and the boys. There is no reason for you to stay out here isolated. In town, you would have helped people to watch the babies while you work. You could find employment, maybe get a job at the livery or the hardware store, something that would give you steady income." Marcus considered this. The cabin held memories of Sarah, both beautiful and painful. Part of him wanted to stay, to hold on to those memories. But another part recognized the practicality of Willa's suggestion. He could not ranch alone with 4 infants to care for. He needed to be around other people, needed the support of a community. "I would need to find a place to live," he said slowly. "Somewhere that could accommodate all of us." "There is a house near my bakery," Willa said. "Old Mrs. Peterson died last month and her children are looking to rent it out. It has 3 bedrooms, a good kitchen, a well in the yard." "The rent is reasonable." She paused. "I already asked about it, just in case you were interested." Marcus looked at her, at the hope and uncertainty in her green eyes, and he understood what she was really offering. Not just a practical solution to his problems, but a chance to build something new. A chance to move forward without forgetting the past. "I am interested," he said quietly. Willa's face broke into a smile that made her look younger and more carefree than he had seen her. "Good. We can leave in a few days. Once I have everything organized, I will help you pack and move. It will be easier with 2. Everything happened quickly after that. Marcus packed up the cabin, taking the things that mattered and leaving the rest for later. He could not bring himself to pack Sarah's clothes, so he left them hanging in the wardrobe, a decision he knew he would regret and reconsider eventually, but could not face now. He loaded the wagon with the baby's supplies, his own few possessions, and the gifts that neighbors had brought. Willa directed the operation with efficient cheerfulness, making sure nothing important was forgotten. The journey to Fort Laramie took most of a day, with frequent stops to feed the babies and rest the animals. The snow had melted enough that the main trail was passable, though still muddy and rough. Marcus drove the wagon while Willa rode her mule alongside, and they talked about practical matters like where to buy furniture and how to arrange childcare. Fort Laramie in late March was a bustling place, full of soldiers and civilians, traders and travelers passing through. The town had grown since Marcus had last spent significant time there, with new buildings going up and businesses expanding. Willa's bakery was on Main Street, a tidy building with large windows and a sign that read Anderson's Bakery in neat black letters. The house Mrs. Peterson's children were renting was 3 buildings down, a white clapboard structure with green shutters and a small porch. Inside it was clean but empty, smelling of lye soap and old wood. Marcus walked through the rooms, imagining where furniture would go, where the babies would sleep, how life would be lived in this space. "What do you think?" Willa asked, watching him carefully. "I think it is perfect," Marcus said honestly. "I will take it." The rent was paid, arrangements were made, and by evening Marcus found himself in a new home with 4 babies and no furniture beyond what Willa loaned him from her own house. They set up pallets on the floor, arranged the babies in their crate, and Willa cooked a simple meal on the small stove while Marcus tried to come to terms with how much his life had changed in less than a month. After they ate, Willa stood to leave and Marcus felt a surge of panic at the thought of her going. "Stay," he said, then clarified, "just for tonight. To make sure we are settled properly. You can have one of the bedrooms. I will stay with the babies in the main room." Willa studied him for a long moment, and Marcus wondered if she could see the loneliness and fear he was trying to hide. Finally, she nodded. "Just for tonight," she agreed. But one night became 2, and then 3, and they both knew they were dancing around something neither was quite ready to name. Willa would go back to her own house in the mornings to manage the bakery, then return in the evenings to help with the babies and share a meal. It was an unusual arrangement, and Marcus knew people were probably talking, but he found he did not care. Willa's presence had become necessary to him in a way that went beyond practical help. A month after moving to Fort Laramie, Marcus found work at the livery stable. The owner, a man named Tom Butler, had known Sarah's father and took pity on Marcus's situation. The work was not glamorous, mucking stalls and tending horses, but it paid steady wages and the hours were flexible enough that Marcus could rush home if one of the babies got sick. Willa helped him find women in town willing to watch the infants during working hours. Mrs. Chen, a Chinese widow who lived above the general store, took charge of the babies with calm competence. She had raised 6 children of her own and seemed completely unfazed by 4 babies at once. Marcus paid her what he could afford, and she supplemented by teaching him how to make simple Chinese dishes that stretched his food budget. Life developed a rhythm. Marcus would wake early, feed the babies with Willa's help if she had stayed over, then take them to Mrs. Chen before heading to the livery. He would work for 8 hours, come home exhausted and smelling like horses, collect the babies, and begin the evening routine. Most nights, Willa would appear with bread or leftover stew, and they would eat together while the babies dozed in their now separate cradles that church ladies had donated. They talked about everything during those evenings. About their childhoods and their dreams, about fears and hopes, about the daily frustrations and small joys of their lives. Marcus told Willa things he had never told anyone, about how scared he had been during the war, about the nightmares he still sometimes had from the things he had seen. Willa told him about her family back in Ohio, about the brother who had died of scarlet fever when she was 12, about how she still felt guilty that she had survived and he had not. The physical attraction between them grew stronger, though neither acted on it. Marcus would catch himself staring at the curve of Willa's neck or the way lamplight caught in her hair, and he would force his eyes away, feeling guilty and disloyal. It had been 6 months since Sarah died, and 6 months felt both like forever and like no time at all. One evening in early May, with the windows open to let in the spring breeze and the babies finally all asleep at the same time, Willa asked the question Marcus had been dreading. "You think Sarah would want you to be alone forever?" Marcus looked up from the harness he was mending, startled. "What? I am not trying to be insensitive," Willa said, her hands still moving through the dough she was kneading for tomorrow's bread. "But I have been thinking about this, about us, about what we are doing and what it might mean." She paused, gathering courage. "You loved Sarah. That is clear in everything you say about her. But she is gone, Marcus, and you are here, and you have 4 sons who need a mother figure, and I think we both know there is something between us that is more than just friendship." Marcus set down the harness, his heart pounding. They had been avoiding this conversation for months, but now that it was here, he found himself both terrified and relieved. "I do care for you," he admitted quietly. "More than I probably should this soon. I feel guilty every time I think about you the way I do, like I am betraying Sarah's memory." Willa came over and sat down across from him, her hands dusted with flour. "You are not betraying anyone by living your life, by finding happiness again. That is not how love works." Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I loved my husband. I still love him, in the way you love someone who is gone but not forgotten. But I also have feelings for you, Marcus. I have tried to keep this professional and friendly, but I cannot help it. You are a good man, and you are trying so hard with these babies, and every time I leave here to go back to my empty house, I hate it a little more." They looked at each other across the scarred wooden table, and Marcus felt something unlock in his chest. He had been holding himself back, holding his feelings in check, because he thought it was what he was supposed to do. But maybe Willa was right. Maybe Sarah would not want him to be alone and miserable. Maybe she would want him to find happiness, to give their sons a mother who could love them. "I do not know how to do this," Marcus said. "How to move forward without feeling like I am leaving her behind." "You bring her with you," Willa said simply. "You keep her memory, you tell the boys about their mother, you honor what you had together, but you also keep living. Because that is what we do. We survive, and we build new lives on top of the old ones, and we find joy where we can." Marcus reached across the table and took her flour-covered hand in his. "I would like to try, if you are willing to be patient with me." "I can be patient," Willa said, and she was smiling through her tears now. "I have waited this long, have I not?" They did not kiss that night or even embrace beyond a brief, awkward hug. But something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing since that first day when Willa had arrived with bread and hope and saved Marcus from drowning in his despair. Over the following weeks, their courtship was quiet and unconventional, shaped by the needs of 4 demanding infants and the watchful eyes of the town. They took walks together on Sunday afternoons, with the babies bundled in a wagon Marcus had modified to hold all 4. They sat together in church, and Marcus introduced Willa to people as his friend, though the knowing looks they received suggested everyone understood it was more than that. Marcus began spending evenings at Willa's house above the bakery, sitting in her small parlor while she taught him to read better. He could manage basic reading enough to get by, but Willa was educated, and she patiently worked through books with him, correcting his pronunciation, explaining words he did not know. It was intimate in a way that had nothing to do with physical touch, this sharing of knowledge, this gentle instruction. The babies grew and thrived. By summer, they were chubby and alert, beginning to smile and make sounds beyond crying. They developed distinct personalities that delighted Marcus. Matthew was serious and watchful. Mark was constantly in motion even when lying down. Luke was placid and easygoing, and John demanded attention and got cranky when ignored. Managing all four was still exhausting, but it got easier as they established routines, and as Marcus became more confident in his abilities as a father. In July, Marcus took Willa out to the cabin for the first time since they had left. The ride out was beautiful, with wildflowers covering the plains and the sky huge and blue overhead. The cabin looked small and weathered, and when Marcus unlocked the door, dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through the windows. Sarah's dresses still hung in the wardrobe where he had left them. Marcus stood looking at them for a long time, and Willa waited patiently, understanding that this was something he needed to do alone. Finally, he took them down, one by one, and folded them carefully into a trunk. "Her sister should have these," he said quietly. "Sarah would want that." "That is a good idea," Willa said. Marcus packed up the rest of Sarah's belongings: the small jewelry box with the locket her grandmother had given her, the embroidery she had been working on, the books she had loved. He set aside her Bible to save for the boys. When everything was packed, he sat down at the table and wrote a letter to Sarah's sister in Colorado, explaining what had happened, apologizing for not writing sooner, promising to send the trunk and to bring the boys to visit when they were older. "I am ready to let this go," he said to Willa. "The cabin, I will sell it or rent it. I do not need to live in the past anymore." Willa came and stood behind him, resting her hands on his shoulders. "Are you sure?" "I am sure," Marcus said, and he meant it. "My life is in Fort Laramie now. With the boys. With you, if you will have me." "I will have you," Willa said softly. They kissed for the first time in that dusty cabin, surrounded by the remnants of Marcus's old life and the possibility of a new one. It was sweet and tentative and tasted like hope. The courtship continued through summer and into fall. By September, everyone in Fort Laramie knew that Marcus and Willa were together, and most people approved. A few older women clucked their tongues about propriety and the appropriate mourning period, but their criticisms were half-hearted. The frontier did not have time for long mourning when practical matters demanded attention, and no one could deny that the arrangement was working well for everyone involved. In October, exactly 1 year after Sarah's death, Marcus asked Willa to marry him. He did it without fanfare in her kitchen while she was making bread and he was feeding Matthew. He simply said, "I love you, and I want you to be my wife and the mother to these boys. Will you marry me?" Willa stopped kneading and looked at him, her eyes shining. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." They were married in November in the same church where Marcus had buried Sarah. It was a small ceremony with just close friends and the babies who fussed through the entire service. The preacher was the same one who had presided over Marcus and Sarah's wedding, and he looked emotional as he pronounced Marcus and Willa husband and wife. Willa moved into the house permanently, bringing her furniture and books and the warmth that had been missing since Sarah died. She took over the spare bedroom, though Marcus hoped that eventually she would share his. They were both adults with past marriages, but there was still a shyness between them, a sense that they needed to learn each other slowly. The first months of marriage were an adjustment. Willa had lived alone for 3 years and was used to her independence and her own schedule. Marcus had grown accustomed to managing the babies his way, and sometimes their different approaches clashed. They had their first real fight over how to discipline Mark, who had started biting when frustrated. Willa wanted to be firm but gentle. Marcus thought they needed to be stricter, and they argued until both were frustrated and angry. They made up that night, talking it through, learning to compromise. It was a pattern that repeated itself in various forms as they navigated their new life together. But underneath, the adjustments and occasional conflicts was a foundation of genuine love and respect that grew stronger with each passing day. The boys adored Willa. They reached for her when they were upset, called for her when they woke from naps, and lit up when she entered a room. She became Mama to them, while Sarah became a story Marcus told, a gentle presence in their lives who had loved them enough to bring them into the world even though it cost her everything. In the spring of 1884, Willa discovered she was pregnant. The news brought mixed emotions. Marcus was thrilled at the thought of another child but terrified of losing Willa the way he had lost Sarah. His fear was so palpable that Willa finally sat him down and made him talk about it. "I cannot promise nothing will go wrong," she said, holding his hands. "But I am strong, and Dr. Harrison says I am healthy, and I am only carrying one baby, not 4. We will take every precaution and we will have faith that everything will be all right." Marcus tried to trust in that faith, but the pregnancy was hard for him. He hovered over Willa, wanted her to rest constantly, nearly drove her crazy with his worry. She bore it with patience, understanding where the fear came from, but she also set boundaries. She continued working in the bakery until she was 7 months along, and she insisted on maintaining her normal activities. In November of 1884, Willa gave birth to a healthy baby girl they named Sarah Willow Jefferson. The labor was long but uncomplicated, and when Dr. Harrison placed the squalling infant in Marcus's arms, he wept with relief and joy and gratitude that both his wife and daughter had survived. The boys were fascinated by their baby sister. At 2 years old, they were walking and getting into everything, and they treated Sarah like a living doll, wanting to touch her and help feed her and give her their toys. Willa and Marcus had to watch constantly to make sure their enthusiastic help did not overwhelm the infant, but it was clear the boys loved their sister fiercely. Life was chaotic with 5 children under the age of 3. The house was always messy, always noisy, always full of laundry and dishes and toys scattered across every surface. Marcus expanded his work at the livery, taking on more responsibility and earning more money. Willa hired help for the bakery so she could spend more time at home. They were tired constantly, but they were also happy in a way that felt earned and real. Little Sarah was a calm baby, easygoing and quick to smile, and Marcus saw echoes of her namesake in her dark hair and gentle temperament. As she grew, she became the princess of the household, doted on by 4 protective older brothers who would fight anyone who made her cry. The years passed in a blur of childhood milestones and seasonal rhythms. The boys started school, and Marcus marveled at how quickly they learned, how different their lives would be from his own rough childhood. Willa taught them to read before they even started formal education, and Matthew in particular showed a love of books that reminded Marcus of his wife. They had another child in 1887, a boy they named William Michael Jefferson. He was a big baby with a loud cry and his mother's green eyes, and he completed their family in a way that felt right and whole. 6 children were more than Marcus had ever imagined having, but he could not imagine his life without any of them. By 1890, Marcus had saved enough money to buy a small ranch outside Fort Laramie. It was not the large spread he had once dreamed of with Sarah, but it was enough. 20 acres with good grass, a sturdy house, a barn that needed work but had good bones. They moved in the spring, and Marcus taught his sons to ride, to care for animals, to do the 100 small tasks that made up ranch life. Willa still owned the bakery but leased it to her former assistant, using the steady income to help support the family. She kept a large garden and chickens, and she baked bread in the ranch house kitchen that was even better than what she had made in town. On Sundays, the whole family would pile into the wagon and drive into Fort Laramie for church, and people would smile at the sight of them, this loud, happy family that had been born out of tragedy and determination. The boys grew tall and strong, each developing their own interests and talents. Matthew wanted to be a teacher. Mark was fascinated by machinery and engines. Luke showed a gift for working with horses, and John declared he wanted to be a cowboy like his father. Little Sarah was smart and stubborn, insisting on learning everything her brothers learned, refusing to be left out because she was a girl. William was the baby, spoiled by everyone and loving it. Marcus made sure the children knew about Sarah, their birth mother. He told them stories about her kindness, her strength, her love. He showed them the Bible she had saved for them, and he made sure they understood that they had two mothers who loved them, one who had given them life and one who had raised them. The boys listened to these stories with interest and affection, but Willa was Mama to them, the one who kissed their scraped knees and scolded them for tracking mud and tucked them in at night. In 1895, Marcus was 42 years old, and Willa was 40. Their oldest children were 13, their youngest was 8, and Marcus sometimes could barely remember the desperate man he had been that terrible winter when he thought his world had ended. He had been given a second chance at happiness, and he had grabbed it with both hands. One evening in late fall, after the children were in bed, Marcus and Willa sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Willa was knitting a scarf for Matthew, and Marcus was whittling a horse for William, and the comfortable silence between them was the kind that came from years of knowing each other deeply. "You ever think about how we met?" Willa asked suddenly. Marcus set down his whittling and looked at her. "All the time. You rode up on that mule like an angel, bringing bread and hope when I had neither." "I was terrified," Willa admitted. "I did not know what I would find when I got here. I was afraid you and the babies might all be dead, but I had to try, had to see if I could help." "You saved us," Marcus said simply, "all 5 of us. We would not have made it without you." Willa reached over and took his hand. "You would have found a way. You are stronger than you think." "Maybe," Marcus said, "but I am glad I did not have to do it alone." They sat in silence for a while longer, hands linked, watching the last light fade from the sky. Inside the house, they could hear the faint sounds of the children settling down for sleep, the creak of bed springs, a giggle quickly shushed. "I love this life we have built," Willa said softly. "I never imagined I would have this again after my first husband died. A family, a home, someone to grow old with." "I never imagined I would survive that winter," Marcus replied. "Let alone find love again, raise 6 children, own a ranch. Sometimes I think about that man alone in the cabin with 4 screaming babies and no idea what to do, and he feels like a stranger, like someone from another lifetime." "He was brave," Willa said. "That man kept going when most people would have given up. He loved his children enough to keep them alive through sheer will. You should not forget him, even if he feels like a stranger now." Marcus thought about that, about the man he had been and the man he had become. "I think Sarah would be happy with how things turned out. I think she would be glad the boys have you, that they have brothers and a sister, that they are growing up with love and opportunity." "I think so too," Willa agreed. "I talk to her sometimes in my head, tell her about the boys, about how they are doing. It probably sounds silly." "It does not sound silly," Marcus said, squeezing her hand. "I do the same thing." The stars were coming out now, brilliant against the darkening sky. Marcus recognized constellations he had learned during long cattle drives, patterns of light that had guided him across the plains when he was young and restless. He was neither young nor restless anymore, but he still loved the stars, loved the reminder of how vast the world was and how small their lives were in comparison, and yet how precious. "I want to grow old with you," he said to Willa. "I want to see these children grown with families of their own. I want 50 more years of sitting on this porch watching sunsets." "That is a good dream," Willa said. "I want that too." And they got it, more or less. Not every day was easy, not every year was kind. There were droughts that killed crops and winters that killed cattle. There were childhood illnesses that terrified them and accidents that left scars. There were arguments and disappointments and the normal struggles of raising children and running a ranch. But there was also so much joy. Birthday parties and Christmas mornings, first days of school and graduations. The boys brought home girls they were courting, and Willa taught them how to be gentlemen. Sarah grew into a beautiful young woman with her mother's strength and her father's determination. William proved to be the family clown, always ready with a joke or a prank. Matthew became a teacher as he had dreamed, taking a position at the Fort Laramie School. Mark went to Denver to study engineering, sending excited letters home about electricity and motors and the future. Luke took over more and more of the ranch work, showing a natural talent for breeding and training horses. John joined a Wild West show for a few years, living out his cowboy dreams before settling down to manage a cattle operation in Montana. Sarah married a young lawyer from Cheyenne, a good man who treated her like a queen and did not mind that she was smarter than him. William became a veterinarian, the first in the family to attend university, and set up practice in Fort Laramie, where he tended to animals and told stories that made his patients' owners laugh. Marcus and Willa became grandparents, and then great-grandparents. Their house was always full during holidays, with children and grandchildren crowding around the dinner table. The noise and chaos reminding Marcus of those early years when the boys were small. He would look at Willa across the table, her hair gone gray, her face lined with age and laughter, and he would feel grateful for every single day they had been given together. In 1912, on a spring morning when the wildflowers were blooming across the prairie, Marcus died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 59. His heart simply stopped, the doctor said later. There was no pain, no warning. He went to bed next to Willa and did not wake up. The funeral was huge, with people coming from all over Wyoming and beyond. All 6 children were there with their families, and the church was packed with friends and neighbors, business associates and former ranch hands. They buried Marcus next to Sarah in the Fort Laramie Cemetery, and Willa stood between the graves of her husband and his first wife and felt nothing but peace. They had all loved each other in different ways, and now they were together again. Willa lived another 8 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, still sharp and independent even as her body grew frail. She died in 1920, in the house she and Marcus had built together, with all her children holding her hands and telling her it was all right to go, that they would be fine, that they loved her. They buried her on the other side of Marcus, and the 3 of them lay in a row. Sarah, who had given life to 4 sons, Marcus, who had fought to keep them alive, and Willa, who had arrived with bread and hope and had given them all a future. The headstones were simple, just names and dates, but the family knew the story. They passed it down through generations, the tale of a terrible winter and a desperate father and a woman brave enough to ride through snow to help a stranger. The ranch stayed in the family for another 50 years, through the Depression and 2 world wars, through droughts and boom times. The original house was eventually torn down and replaced, but pieces of it remained. A beam here, a door frame there, a fireplace that had warmed 4 babies who had been born in a blizzard and had survived because 2 people refused to give up. And in Fort Laramie, in the Historical Society's collection, there was a photograph from 1895. It showed a family on a porch, a man and woman in their 40s, surrounded by 6 children of various ages. They were all looking at the camera, and most of them were smiling. The man had his hand on his oldest son's shoulder, and the woman held the youngest child on her lap. In the background, you could just make out the plains stretching to the horizon, endless and full of possibility. The photograph was labeled, Marcus and Willa Jefferson with their children, 1895. But those who knew the full story understood. It represented something more. It was proof that love could rise from the ashes of tragedy, that hope could survive the darkest winters, that families could be built and rebuilt, and that what mattered was not how they began but how they endured. The story of Marcus and Willa became part of Fort Laramie's history, told and retold until it took on the quality of legend. But unlike most legends, this one was entirely true. There really had been a cowboy alone with 4 babies in a blizzard. There really had been a woman who arrived with bread and hope. And they really had found love in the midst of grief and had built a life together that lasted through all the years given to them. Their great-great-grandchildren still lived in Wyoming, scattered across the state, carrying forward the legacy of strength and stubbornness and love that Marcus and Willa had passed down. Some of them were teachers, some ranchers, some worked in offices in cities far from the plains. But all of them knew the story of their ancestors, knew about the terrible winter of 1882, and the 2 people who had refused to let tragedy have the final word. On cold winter nights, when snow piled high and the wind howled around houses that were warm and secure, they would sometimes tell the story to their own children. About courage and kindness, about second chances and the strength it takes to keep going when everything seems lost. About a cowboy who had 4 babies in a blizzard, and the woman who arrived with bread and hope and changed everything. And in the telling, Marcus and Willa lived on, their love story preserved like a warm coal against the cold, a reminder that even in the harshest seasons, spring would eventually come, and that sometimes the best things in life grew from the most unlikely beginnings. The bread Willa had brought that desperate day had long since been eaten, but the hope she carried had multiplied and spread, feeding not just for hungry babies but generations that followed, nourishing them with the knowledge that they came from people who had survived the impossible and had found joy on the other side of sorrow.